history is littered with examples of new technologies coming onto the scene, upsetting the status quo, and eventually things settle out. Do artists still paint paintings? Absolutely. Do photographers still take photos? Absolutely. But now we have AI that can do both of those things, and they're upsetting these people who were previously upset over other things. It continually spins like that.
My guest today is engineer, mixer, and podcaster Matt Boudreau. Matt's musical journey began in the late 1980s as a band member and drummer, eventually transitioning into the world of audio recording in 1994. Since then, he's developed expertise in stereo and Dolby Atmos mixing, with credits including Alanis Morissette, Cab For Cutie, and Green Day, among many others. Matt is also the founder and host of Working Class Audio, a podcast with 20,000 monthly listeners and over 530 episodes. During the interview, we spoke about the evolution of immersive audio, his innovative approach to mixing in Atmos, his insights after 500 plus podcasts, encouraging authenticity in music production, and much more. I spoke with Matt from his studio in the Bay Area. So the last time we talked was 2021. Last time we talked here. And you were just setting up your Atmos room at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So what have you learned between now and then when it comes to immersive?
Well, there's been a lot of developments in terms of the technology has matured quite a bit in terms of the tools that Dolby provides. You know, of course, Avid has got the Dolby Render integrated into Pro Tools, and that switch to that has made it much easier for me. As far as what I've learned, I still feel that we're early days here in the world of, I'm just going to say immersive, because as of this recording, as we speak, Samsung and Google have introduced Eclipsia, or I'm not sure how you say it, but that's a new development. So what I've learned is that the taste or the desire for a immersive format must be strong enough, or to some degree, if Google and Samsung are willing to go up against Dolby to compete. And I feel that some form of immersive technology will prevail in the end, whether that's a beta versus VHS type battle, I don't know. So the idea that it's going away and that it's a fad, I'm not worried about that. I feel like some version of it is going to stay. So I don't feel like this investment in these speakers that you may or may not see around me was a failed experiment. I think it's been great. It's been great for me, and it's been great for a lot of friends of mine.
I hear a lot about Sony 360 lately.
Yeah, still?
Well, yeah, apparently there's something new that's going on. Sony 360 RA, it's a different environment, and it's especially for creators. And I've heard raves about it. One of the things about Samsung and Google is I haven't seen any creator tools.
That's right. I have heard that they are introducing a plugin for Pro Tools. And also, as of this recording, I'm told that there's a tool out there that allows you to take an Atmos ADM file and put it into a thing that converts it to that format. I am a little skeptical of the Google Samsung thing, because we're talking about, two tech giants getting involved in an area that, do they really have any expertise or precedent-setting audio that they've accomplished? I don't know.
Well, what I can tell you is that their installed base is huge for Samsung. And I do a lot of traveling all over the world. And one of the things I've noticed is every hotel room everywhere has a Samsung TV, and every airport, all the monitors are Samsung.
Yeah.
So their installed base is huge. That doesn't say that much for the audio portion, which is, the software that comes with the TVs are usually pretty awful. So it doesn't bode well for everything else, I have to say.
Well, I don't want any of these things. I don't root for their failure. I joke about Sony. I mean, I've met Hiro and June over at Sony, and they're fabulous people. And I think that they're coming out with tools that hopefully will rise up and be adopted by the masses. But there's so much competition, and then it's also, I think, a matter of consumer education. Now that's where Google and Samsung could really prevail. Is they've got, as you say, they're big. Well, they're big market players. Number one, everybody knows Google, everybody knows Samsung, and if they can, at the flick of a switch, install their technologies, across everything that's already out there, they may have a good run at it. But it's a tricky thing, because you've got to educate the consumer, you've got to have the consumer demand, and then you have to have the pros on board, and the two have to meet at some point. It can't exist only in the pro world, and it can't only exist in the consumer world.
Well, I don't know if you went through this, but I did. When 5.1 surround first came out, and I was on the cutting edge. I did a lot of 5.1 projects, 120 different ones, a lot of concerts, a lot of, you name it, television shows, repurposing them, things like that. So it was a good time to be in that part of the business. That being said, all of a sudden, it was like overnight, the faucet closed. And the reason why was the consumer demand wasn't what they had expected. And a big problem was I think they call it the wife problem, meaning that you needed to set up, especially your surround speakers, in order for them to be optimum, they have to be in the right place and everything. And for the right place, it usually meant putting it in front of a door. And then there were the ugly cables that were going everywhere. And that, in many ways, stifled it. Now, we have ways around that now. So that's the good part of those things. But there's still the problem where it has to be aesthetically pleasing in order to work, and, in a consumer environment. And that's the sad part of it that, people don't take into account.
Yeah, and it gets confusing, I think, for the consumer when there's just so many things, so many technologies. If you're an everyday person who has a passing interest in audio, or you just want to watch the show, you've got, as a company, you've got big hurdles to jump over to convince a consumer. So, while I'm bullish on Atmos and I think it's amazing, I'll be the first to admit there's a lot of work to be done on the consumer side. The cars, that's coming. Car development takes a long, long time. It's not a thing that you can. It's not like mass producing televisions. It's a very different animal, I think, in the production and marketing and the creation process. So that's a big help. That's a big educator. But unfortunately, for better or for worse, the early adopters of a technology like Atmos in the car area are more high-end cars, Mercedes, Cadillac, and not to piggyback off my own name of my own show, but it's not very working class. It's got to be. You've got to get that middle class, working class approach to a technology like that if you're going to have mass adoption.
Well, that being said, there's certainly, when it comes to theatrical, we've certainly had mass adoption there, because every theater now is Atmos approved, Atmos installed. So that's not a problem. And I think everybody kind of expects that in that realm. Not so much when it comes to anything else, as far as from what I've seen. Which leads me to a question for you. So we've all been there where we've heard classic albums that were remixed in Atmos and have been really disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally there's something that you go, wow, that's pretty awesome. But I hate to say it, but it's occasionally that happens. So what's your approach? Because you just agreed with me that happens. So what's your approach in order to get around that?
To get around disappointment?
Well, to get around the fact that maybe the approach that some of other mixers are taking isn't quite working?
Well, I mean, that's a tough act to follow. Number one, when you have a classic album, it's been cemented into the minds, into the ears, the brains, and the hearts of, tons of people. And it's one thing to go from, when we went from vinyl to CD, we see the usual suspects, the Steely Dans, the Michael Jacksons, any of those like cutting edge, high fidelity records are usually the ones first to be ported over to the new thing. And when it comes to Atmos, you're breaking with convention there of stereo, and it's not like you're just changing formats from vinyl to CD. You're actually changing the playback of it on a drastic level. So if it differs in any way, it's a challenge. Now, Michael Romanowski and I had this discussion where in the days when Blu-ray or SACD or any of these formats where you could do something a little different existed, that was an ideal solution, because the problem that we've got now is that while it's a bonus that we've got Apple Music, Tidal, Amazon, all supporting Atmos, the problem in that, though, is that it's sitting side by side with the stereo. So you can switch back and forth. And if it's on by default and the equipment is not there in a way that, if the mix isn't good and the equipment is not there in an ideal performance type situation, in other words, like a speaker array, then you're setting yourself up for potential failure. Whereas in the days of these physical formats that had Atmos or 5.1 things, you could get the special edition like Flaming Lips 5.1, and it was a unique thing, but it also appealed to a unique audience. So the way I get around it now is I tried early on to get some catalog work, and I failed miserably, because there was just such an influx of people. And unless you were in Los Angeles and knew some people to get that work, I found it to be very difficult to get it. So fortunately, it didn't work out, because I discovered what a colossal pain in the ass it is to do that catalog work. There's so much, you probably spend a week to 2 weeks just getting up to speed with recreating the stereo mix from assets that you may be given. And I won't go into all the permutations of how that could, be a long drawn out process. But once you get that and you do the Atmos mix, I think took less time than the process of, reconstituting the stereo mix. So I'd focused on, I got a few name acts that I got to work on for new material. Green Day, Alanis Morissette, Deaf Heaven. Actually, Deaf Heaven was a collaboration with me and Jack Shirley, who produced the original Sunbather record for that band, which was a seminal album for them. I think it was like 10 years ago. So that was a slightly different situation. But for the most part, 95% of my work, and probably 98% of my work, is independent bands who control their own budgets, control their own catalog. And I learned during the Green Day process, the Green Day thing was taking the theme song to the Real Time with Bill Maher show, turning that into Atmos, because HBO wanted to stream Atmos live, including the theme song. So we had to deliver that to them. We had to deliver an Atmos mix and other variations of that. But along the way, in doing that, I learned, wait a minute, we don't have to split this process up. We could actually do this at the same time. In other words, we could have one Pro Tools session that's doing the Atmos mix and generate the stereo mix at the same time. And so once the renderer found its way into Pro Tools, I started to develop some ideas, tested them out with a young high school jazz band of these young men who are now graduated and in college and going to, Berkeley and UCLA. But they did a jazz record. If you heard it, you'd think, oh my gosh, these are adults, but they were just kids. But that album allowed me to test the waters with this mixing in stereo and Atmos. Once I did that, I was like, okay, this is it. This works. So I started to create a template. I put a thing out on YouTube and just to, educate some people on the idea. And what it does is this: it economizes the process for the artist from a cost perspective. And it also economizes the process for me. I don't have to do, let's get the stereo mix and now let's print stems and now let's do the Atmos mix. And it's just like, let's just squeeze this all down into one process. So it's cheaper for them. It's a simpler process for me, but I'll just charge a little more money than I would otherwise for a stereo mix, and we get both sets of assets out of it. So that's how I've been approaching it. And then the economic part of that equation too is to look beyond the streaming services. There's immersiveaudioalbum.com where, admittedly, audiophiles as the audience are buying downloads, MKV files, which is essentially like it's a container. For those that don't know what it is, I barely know what it is. It's a container. It's almost like a FLAC file version of the Atmos mix that they can download. And they're paying, $20 to $25 for an album, $5 for a single. So I try to educate my clients about that, to say, here are the streaming services that you could be on. Here's this other thing that's like a Bandcamp style, iTunes style old. Download the digital file format. It's an 80-20 split. So that's another part of it, is just not just being an engineer, is being a bit of a business person to say, let me show you some economic outlets for what you're doing here, and not just say, here's the file, good luck, give me my money. I don't want to do that. I want to participate and show them this is how we can grow this.
It's funny because there's so much in audio that's sort of like that. And music, I should say, not just audio, where you have artists that they work so hard in their album, and then you ask them, so now what are you going to do? And they go, well, I don't know. So they have this great album. They never thought a second about selling it or marketing it. And that happens woefully too many times. I hate to say it. They'll have a magnificent album. And you go, well, now what? Say, well, I don't know. And you figure with all the information out there, that you would have some sort of a clue, and people would, but musicians just want to be a musician, because you're one.
Mm-hmm.
You just want to play, especially when you're younger. You don't want to know about the business most of the time.
Yeah.
So that kind of stifles a lot of people before they even start.
And I don't know if my interest in that comes from, having been a drummer, having had a couple record deals in the days prior to cell phones and the internet, and now on the other side of the glass, seeing all the crazy opportunities that musicians have outside a major label system, just in terms of, taking absolute control of their destiny. I think, to the best of my knowledge, and I might not have all the information correct here, but my understanding is that Joe Bonamassa is one who is a great example of that. When he books a venue, like, he rents the venue out of pocket, from what I understand. And he deals with the music industry in a way that I think is really fantastic. And we all know who Joe Bonamassa is.
Sure.
So there's people like that, and prior to his death, Steve Albini famously, didn't really participate in the music industry. I mean, yes, he worked on Nirvana and Page Plant. He did a couple records in that world, but his day-to-day meat and potatoes work, from what I gather, was independent bands coming to Electrical Audio.
Yeah.
And I look to people like that and I think, okay, I want to play in that world. I want to be one of those people who helps get stuff done and facilitate things outside of that major label system, because I don't know, I think the major label system is so outdated.
Yeah. And what's scary about that is now we're finding that, especially over the last week, where you have the majors that are buying more catalog. So now they're relying more on catalog than they are on anything that's new and artist development, which used to be a really big deal and now almost seems like an afterthought.
I also have heard stories of major labels coming in and buying independent, like a Bandcamp, but not Bandcamp.
Yeah.
So there's an attorney that I follow online that was talking about this, and I thought, ooh, that could be a challenge, because apparently the approach is they come in, they could buy an independent entity that's selling independent music, and they look at who's trending, come at them and say, hey, independent artist, we see you're trending. We could join forces and we could put your stuff out. And if that independent artist then refuses, they could they could quash them very easily and prevent them from, going any further.
Yeah. And you know what it's like when you're first starting, anything that seems like it's going to take your career to another level or is going to help your career, you're on board with. Don't think about the consequences. You just do it.
Yeah.
So therein lies the problem. Let's go someplace else for a second. So how are you feeling about AI in music?
I don't have the skies falling thought process that some people do. I mean, I think both of us have seen a lot of technologies come, and everybody, oh my gosh, drum machines. What is this world coming to? And, drummers are still in demand, but there is music that really benefits from programming drum machines, artificial drums. I don't think it's ever going to be a 100% black and white outcome for any of this stuff. AI is going to come, it's going to have its place, it's going to take over in some areas, and it's going to hurt us in some areas, it's going to benefit us in some areas, and I think it will settle into its place. As far as, audio is concerned, I love what's out there. I mean, and I don't know if you could consider Gullfoss AI or not, but some of these new type
machine learning, yes,
machine learning
part of it.
Yeah, Sonable Smart EQ. I welcome it with open arms to see what it can do. It always, to me, goes back to, I understand people's concerns about, losing economic opportunity as a result, but it's like the horse and the buggy whip. It's like when the car was introduced, I'm sure that was quite upsetting to a lot of people. When photography was introduced, artists were up in arms. So history is littered with examples of new technologies coming onto the scene, upsetting the status quo, and, eventually things settle out. Do artists still paint paintings? Absolutely. Do photographers still take photos? Absolutely. But now we have AI that can do both of those things, and they're upsetting these people who were previously upset over other things. So, it's just, it continually spins like that. So
I have a love-hate relationship with it. And of course, I wrote a book on AI for music production. So I went and I studied 120 different plugins. I used them. I actually used them. So, and this is in everything that goes from music production to, or creation to production to even to, imaging and, everything in between. And my feeling is, I don't know how somebody could possibly trust something that might be wrong. Like a large language model. Okay, can you really trust this output? And if that's the case, you have to double check it. You're kind of defeating the purpose. So that bothers me, I have to say.
Well, I'll give you an example. Like early on with drum samples, Sound Replacer in Pro Tools existed, and when I discovered utilizing that tool, I would use it and I would realize, oh, okay, not all these samples are in phase, and I need to go back and I need to triple check it. So it that would beg the question, well, why even go through that hassle? Well, then along comes Slate Trigger, solves many, many problems. And like anything that's new, it's going to go through its growing pains. And I'll be the first to admit that with Working Class Audio, all my interviews I do, I have Zoom AI running so that I can look at the summary and recall what we talked about, and just, I can draw from that information and create my show notes from that information in a rapid fashion. And so that's an example of where it speeds up my process. Do I 100% rely on it? Not exactly, but there's elements of it that I can cherry pick and utilize to speed my process.
Yeah. I've used it very successfully as a book editor twice. And what I would ask it to do is check any grammar, check spelling, of course, but also I would highlight certain areas and say, "Can you make this clearer?"
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it would, sometimes it wasn't as good, but nonetheless, I thought it was a very successful use. It didn't write anything for me. It just sort of took my words and made it a little clearer. And even that wasn't that many times. But what ended up happening was when you upload a book, I self-publish currently anyway. When you upload a book to Amazon, it automatically does a check for all this. And if there's too many errors, it kicks it back. And, if there's a dozen errors, small things, lets it go through. And that's kind of the norm, to be a dozen, 15, you'll have two thes or something like that. And this time there was two. And the two that were there were jargon that it wouldn't have understood.
Right.
So I looked at that and I thought, okay, this is a very successful use for it.
I'll tell you another successful use. My wife will be the first to tell you that sometimes the tone of my voice when I say something, while my intention might be good, sometimes I come off quite harsh. And as a matter of fact, Lid Shaw from Recording Studio Rockstars joked, we were talking about astrological signs. And he goes, "What are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a Sagittarius." He goes, "I think you're an Agitarius." And I said, yeah, I know, I can be that way. And so what I've found is in replying in potentially heated situations or situations where the verbiage could get escalated on an email with somebody, I find that running my email through ChatGPT and saying, "Can you make sure that I have a diplomatic tone here and that I don't have an aggravated sounding tone?" And I found it very, great for that. And one time I was doing an email thing with my wife and we were trying to send an email to I think the principal of our kids' school over a potential situation with one of our kids. And I sent the email to my wife to check, which I always do in those situations. And she was like, "Wow, this is great. Did you write this?" I said, "No, I wrote it and then I proofed it through ChatGPT." And she was like, "Yeah, okay. Because this sounds really, really good and really, really diplomatic, unlike you."
Let's go someplace else. You mentioned it a couple times about your podcast.
Yeah, Working Class Audio.
You're way past 500 episodes now. What are you up to?
Next Monday, it'll be 530. Yeah, right behind you.
Yeah, pretty much. So what have you learned over the course of all of those?
I've learned how to jump into a conversation and rapidly find out about somebody. I've also learned that I have a very strong interest in other people's journeys and their stories. It wasn't evident in the very beginning to me, but after a while, I was like, "Oh, you really like asking people questions." And I would look back into social situations of the past where I was essentially doing the same thing. I was so curious about a person in their life and how their life came together as it was. And that in the early days when I was much younger, it was kind of met with, "Why are you asking me that?" Or what business is that of yours? Working Class Audio gives me the license to ask, peers and colleagues, mutual friends of ours, sometimes tough questions, sometimes just kind of general broad stroke type questions. And it didn't take me 530 episodes to learn this, but I know from talking to all these people that there's still always something new to learn. There's so much to learn. And, I've been in audio for 30 years. I'm 55 at this point. And I know one thing, that I don't care how much experience you have, you're not the smartest person in the room. There's always somebody who's got, whether they're younger or older, there's something to learn from somebody. And I think that I'll tell you what it has taught me, that younger people I think really have a lot to offer and present. And older people, I think by nature, a lot of them, have that. I've been doing this for 30 years and, long before you were born. I've learned that that's not really a great approach if you want to continue to be a student of life. You gotta see young people as, yeah, you may have more experience than them, but they're also paying attention to things that you've chosen to ignore or be fearful of. And obviously it's the same for younger people looking at older people as, oh, you're outdated. You don't know what you're talking about. That's also a mistake.
One of the things that I found was you never really know somebody until you interview them. And this would be with some of my longtime friends that, I'd know for 20 and 30 years. And I would interview them and I go, I never knew that about you. And so many times that would come up and I go, how is it that we never talked about this before? So that's always struck me. And it's always a reason why I like to get some of my friends on if they fit. Because, again, you think you know somebody, but you really don't when it's all said and done.
Yeah, and it strangely bonds you to people because I'll interview people that I've only met through a Zoom call, and then I see them in person, and they embrace me like we've been friends for years, and it only occurs to me right then and there that, oh, this is the first time we're meeting in person. But I find that the conversations I have with people aren't. And I feel like this is true about your conversations. It doesn't feel like we're watching or listening to like 60 Minutes or a news type thing where it's very like the lines of interview and interviewee are so defined. I find that it's a more collaborative, bring out the information type thing, and so you have a bond with the person that you're interviewing.
Is there anything you'd like to change?
About what?
About the podcast, about what you're doing there?
I kind of adapt as time goes along to things that as my experience and view on the world changes. So maybe my questions or my line of questioning or the way I do it slightly changes. But the only change that I'm making now is I ignored YouTube for 10 years because I was so fearful of video. And I edit out a lot of filler words and try to make my conversations very succinct.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that you could get away with that on a video, but then I learned, oh, actually you can. And so I jumped into Premiere Pro and took a shot at editing some things, made some, early videos and figured out where I need to improve. And I just continue to do it and put the show, just the interview portion of the show out on YouTube. And so video is, I think, if anything, that's what I want to change. And I'm changing it is video is becoming a part of my repertoire.
All right. Last question. What's something about you that people don't know, but you wish they did?
I think my heart's in the right place. I think for the most part, people know that, I'm sincere in what I do. I'm not out there bullshitting people. And I try to, I just try to do the right thing. And maybe that's, people don't always agree with that. Sometimes I'll say things that I think is the right thing to say, but, may run counter to what others are thinking. But for the most part, I think, I'm not just some content creator out there. I'm a in the trenches engineer doing work with a lot of independent bands and have been for a long time. So yeah, I guess that's about the best answer I can come up with there. Sorry.
That's a good one. No, that is good because, we all do so much that it's easy to misunderstand.
Yeah. I'm just a big believer in people, for better or for worse, just being themselves. And I try to be myself as much as possible. Who I am in public is pretty much the same person that I am at home. Maybe I'm a little more patient in public. I think my friends know that I have little patience for bullshit. Is really at the end of the day, and for insincere situations, it drives me nuts. And the older I get, I think the worse. I think my filter starts to come off a little more as I get older, which I think is commonplace for people growing older. But yeah, And actually, that was, I wanted to touch on that with you. Is you asked me in your sign up for the interview what I wanted to talk about. One of the things I just want to mention, just piggybacking on that being yourself thing, is I think that if there's a piece of advice I could encourage some of the younger people coming up in the world of audio and music, is to, most definitely be yourself. I think that in pro audio specifically, while I have absolute love and great respect for everything that Pure Mix has done and Mix with the Masters and Produce Like a Pro, all of these situations, and that would include you, everything that you're teaching, I think that all of that content is fantastic and it really kind of educates people. But what I worry about is people spending too much of their development time not developing themselves, but trying to chase what other people do, whether it's via presets or downloading templates and trying to be like Vance Powell, like Andrew Sheps, or insert name of fantastic person engineer here. I think it can be self-sabotaging, and I really want to encourage people to learn from those areas that you can, such as all those things I just mentioned, but also put a great emphasis on just learning to be yourself and developing your own thing, your own sound. And it may be different from other people, but when we have different from other people, we have people like Chad Blake, right? We have unique and completely original people show up like that. And I think if we could have more of that, I think our world would be more entertaining, at least on the music front.
That's a good place to stop, I think. Excellent, Matt.
Thanks, Bobby. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I'll see you next time.